Welcome to the Education and Empowerment Podcast. In this show, our hosts explore success and advancement through education by interviewing today's top leaders in the fields of education, business, and technology in order to provide insight into what it really takes to succeed. This show is brought to you by Forstay, a SaaS-enabled online booking marketplace for student and intern housing. Forstay provides turnkey, all-in-one cloud-based accommodation software solutions for colleges, universities, and organizations. Learn more at offcampus.forstay.com and landlords.forstay.com. All right, let's get into the show.
Welcome to another great episode of Education and Empowerment Podcast. This episode is titled Discover Your Potential Through Language Learning. With the rise of technology, language learning and acquisition has become much more easier and accessible. Learning another language helps not only understand what's being taught or discussed, but also helps discover hidden talents, strengths, and abilities. Being raised in one culture or language poses specific mentality and norms. And learning another language sometimes could challenge what you know and helps you discover what's beyond. We're lucky to have CEO of Lingoda, Michael Shangkuan. Today he's going to enlighten us on the importance of language learning in developing and discovering our potential as young people. Mr. Shangkuan is a graduate of Yale University and Harvard Business School, who learned 6 different languages. This episode will cover his career that he started from Wall Street to education EdTech company CEO, and we hope this will be an inspiration to young professionals and students who are learning another language. Without further ado, let's get into the episode. Hello and welcome to Education and Empowerment Podcast. This is your host, Bakhtiyor Isoev, and this morning I'm very thrilled to welcome Michael Shangkuan. Without further ado, Michael, there's so much about you that we want to learn and to really dive into your story. I can't wait to hear it. Welcome to our show.
Thanks so much for having me, Bakhtiyor.
Amazing. I wanted to get us started by, learning more about how you ended up in Lingoda.
Yeah, absolutely. So Lingoda is an online live language learning platform. We offer live classes with live teachers. And so going back in the day, I was born and raised in the United States. My parents emigrated to the States from Taiwan, and they raised me to be a good Chinese son. And a good Chinese son is supposed to excel at science and math, become an engineer or a doctor.
Right.
Instead, I loved French at school. And in fact, in high school, in addition to French, I added Spanish and Russian during the weekdays. And then I added Japanese and Chinese on the weekends. So I was studying many, many languages all at the same time. And then I went on to college and business school and went to work for big companies as a good Chinese son would. But then ultimately, about 12 years ago, came back to my true passion, which is education. And I think which brings us to have this conversation today. My first company was Terra Education, and I was CEO of what is a B Corp that offers life-changing service leadership summer programs to teens in Africa, South America, and Asia. And I always see it as everybody is underprivileged and could do more when it comes to developing a deeper understanding of the other. I myself was lucky to study abroad in Japan, France, and Taiwan when I was young. And I wanted to provide that opportunity to as many high school kids as I possibly could, which is why I joined that. And then to get to today and your question, I came to Europe 6 years ago to run Lingoda. And ultimately, Lingoda has now become Europe's largest online language school, and we offer classes in French, German, Spanish, and English. And I'm also the first Asian American CEO of a German company.
That's very, very impressive. It reminds me of my own, college years when I came into the States and in pursuit of higher education. And then I was asked, how many languages I know. And, all of my American classmates would be surprised that I knew several languages, which, kind of reminds me that, it's not easy to learn the language. So I was going to ask you, is it difficult to learn, so many languages the way, you learned them? And what did, learning all those 6 languages bring you?
Difficulty. So I would say it's a misconception. You're nodding your head. And I think for both of us, I think it's more about good habits, the right curriculum, and the right teachers. I think it's critical actually that you learn with live teachers because language is about speaking and communicating. I really don't think it's about talent. I think it's more about the determination and ability to reach a long-term goal versus instant gratification, which is what we seek a lot nowadays. If I want to get better in tennis, I would not expect to be better at tennis just by having 1 lesson or 2 lessons, right? Or by watching somebody play tennis, or by maybe hitting it once, but never actually serving what I'm really bad at, right? So all of these things, you have to be active in playing tennis. You got to do it consistently, day in and day out, and you got to do it over a longer period of time to get better. I think it's the same thing with language learning. At the end of the day, the US State Department says it takes 600 hours of class time, longer language like Russian or Chinese, but shorter if it's something like Spanish or French, 600 hours of class time with live teachers to learn a language. And I just don't think there's a shortcut around that.
That's exactly right. I mean, that takes so much passion and discipline and consistency, to really, get to that. Michael, it's a big privilege to actually learn from you. I mean, language learning definitely opens a lot of doors. It really helps, you discover your hidden strengths and potential and, what you're capable of. Sometimes that, you don't know you have, hidden talents. And there's got to be something like, maybe something that motivates you, maybe a motto or a quote that, drives you. Was there something like that for you? Like what were you motivated by? Maybe do you have a motto or any quote that you live by day to day when you're waking up?
Well, the question is how much time do you have? But maybe we'll keep it more, we'll keep it closer to relevant to education and to language. The quote that comes to mind for me, Bakhtiyor, is from Nelson Mandela. So he once said, if you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. If you talk to him in his language,
right,
that goes to his heart. And what I think that really means is, if I take it to a higher level, is it helped me to develop my CQ, my cultural quotient. When I was young, when you were young,
right,
we were very focused on IQ, right? Book smarts. Then I think in the 90s, the focus became more about EQ, right? Emotional. Right. I think today, looking at the world, but also in terms of how long we live and this importance to see the world from different perspectives and to see and connect with different people, it's more and more about CQ. It's about building bridges with people around the world, because it's ultimately language that's the opening into a culture and its people.
You touched upon a very important subject here, and obviously there are differences in how you and I learned and how the new generation is learning, and obviously learning is not just learning; it's a bigger part of the system and perhaps the education that we live in today. As an entrepreneur and edupreneur in this field, can you identify maybe 1 or 2 trends that you are seeing in education industry today?
Sure, that's a really great question. So I think about it, there's many trends that are happening in education. I, in particular, would like to articulate 2 of those. The first one is that the millennial generation will be looking at multiple careers versus let's say my parents' generation,
Right.
was looking at one career, right? 20th century, right? Basically, in the past, it was like you got an education, you were an engineer for 40 years, you had the same skills, and then you retired. Now people are living longer. There are more opportunities. And as a result, what is important changes. So what might be an important skill or knowledge, hard skill or knowledge today, like coding, might not be important in 25 years. So one of the things that I challenge each person listening and to the educators is that with this multiple job career shift, how can we enable people to learn the soft skills of creativity, empathy,
Right.
and most importantly, I would say flexibility and plasticity, because those are the things actually that are going to get us through those 100 years versus what was traditionally those 70 years. And then the second trend is how can, and both you and I have experiences in different parts of the world, but
Right.
I ask is how can the US and the world and the West positively impact the world? How can we build those bridges? And this is ultimately up to the next generation, and it's up to the educators to help the next generation. My question to us is, how can we educate the next generation on real world savvy versus book smarts? How can we inspire them to realize their potential to transform the world and their role in it? And I invite each student to immerse themselves in a culture that's very different from their own, to leave that comfort zone, to have what I call a crucible experience,
Right.
which is to go learn a foreign language and use it to immerse yourself in that foreign community and to connect with that foreign community. Because it's through that it will shine a light on your own assumptions, values, and identity that you took for granted prior to. And when you have that opening, especially as a younger person, you will be open to those openings in the future.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you touched on those, two very, very important points, which lead me to, understanding that, our podcast listeners who are, probably interested in learning more about the work that you do, or maybe learning more about Europe, would like to learn more about, your experience living and leading and learning and, educate, young generation. Can you elaborate on your experience living in Germany and tell us maybe how the education in Germany works? And I think this is kind of what is going to help us with the first and the second answer that you just shared with us.
Sure, that is something that I love to talk to you more about. When I was in university, took a class on education systems around the world, and I've lived in 7, 8 different countries, and I've really looked at how education works and how it affects society. So Germany is obviously the latest one. I've been there for 6 years. And the education philosophy is totally different, okay? It's a Western country, but it's different in the sense that the Germans really value and pride themselves on something called Selbstbestimmung, which translated into English, roughly speaking, is self-determination. Self-determination from an early age, before even kindergarten, all the way through university, in having kids explore, experiment, and discover. And in particular, I see this because I work with a lot of people coming out of university or out of high school at my company. And in particular, I see this with that they, in high school or after, spend 1 year abroad, number one, often starting by learning a language, but also to immerse themselves in another culture. And then when they go into university, they will have study, interns, and travel broken up at different times. So whereas, I don't know when you graduated, but I was eager beaver, just like everybody else, following the herd, going to college at 17, graduating at 21, wanting to graduate at 20, starting my first job that summer, and then just, off to the horses. And, 21, okay, when you tell a German that, they typically graduate from university in the mid to late 20s, right? What are they doing? They're studying. Okay, then they take a break, and they say, okay, I'm going to do an intern in this. Okay, take a break, travel. Take a break. I learned something new about myself and about the world. I'm actually go back and study. Okay, now I know that. Now I want to go back and travel and understand that better. So this experience is very much of the self-determination, which I think is a beautiful thing, which allows you to develop more into a whole person. And I would say that overall, now having many German friends, is that they are more worldly on average and more balanced in the way that they see things compared to my average American friend.
That's such an insightful take here, Michael. What's really impressive is that, living in different countries, as you said, you gain so many friends and you learn, through friends, or maybe through learning a different language, you also learn the culture and you experience it and you learn all of those, differences. I'm sure our, podcast listeners would be, interested in understanding, what sort of trends are there these days. Like if you wanted to learn, specific language or, languages in general, can you perhaps, identify, based on your, vast experience of running, a tech company and being in education and language learning, what are those critical trends that are shaping, the day-to-day that, you could share with our podcast listeners today?
Sure, that's a good question. So now as we dive in a little bit deeper to the language industry, I see three. The first is there's a lot of skepticism in America in language learning. Most Americans would say, I tried to learn, let's just say Spanish for a minute, right? I tried to learn Spanish in high school. I tried to learn Spanish in college. I tried to learn Spanish through fill in the gap apps. And I never really got that. It never really happened, right? So I think in their mind, they would say, okay, they have been oversold to and under-delivered, and I don't have a talent for it. It's not my calling, right? And at the end of the day, people want results, right? When they spend all that time and money, they want to be able to speak a lot better. So I think this is one thing, that there is this skepticism, and it's unfortunate, I would say, as a trend. But what can we do actually to make the right methods easily available to Americans? This is where we talked a little bit earlier about it's so important because it's about communication, that you have interaction and speaking as much as possible with native speaking teachers. But on top of that, in this busy world, we want flexibility, right? You're busy, I'm busy. No, I can't go 3 p.m. to a language school on a Wednesday to go learn French.
Right.
What I want, just like with all the new technology out there, is we want everything on demand, right? So how do we have language classes, Spanish classes fit for Bakhtiyor that are advanced intermediate, that fit around his schedule with his work and his personal demands, whenever, wherever. So I would say that's number two. Then I would say number three is, as we get out of some of the COVID dynamics, people are seeking these travel experiences that shape them, these crucible travel experiences that go beyond, here's your English-speaking guide, here's the Eiffel Tower, and here's your 3-day tour of Paris. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, right? And actually, that is what we often do in our first experience when we are abroad. But what I see this evolution is melding language and travel to be a key part of that experience, so that you can connect much more deeply with somebody else. And it's uncomfortable at first, but I think more and more people are realizing, as they have been sheltered in their community and not having access to others, people different from them, that now they can actually do that.
Wow. And was there a third one that you wanted to share with us as well?
Oh, I think I stopped counting. So I think I think the third one was around these travel experiences.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And Michael, I mean, what I'm hearing is just like you said, this, skepticism, has always been there and will be there. But, thanks for educators and entrepreneurs like yourself to understand the human dynamics, the learning and the styles and the modes of learning. I took an interesting course with Professor Richard Elmore, a professor of Harvard, about modes of learning. And then I was really impressed by the depth of the different tools that are available for us in order to really learn to what we need, right? Understanding everybody's learning style and how people perceive and such. So which kind of reminds me that on a day-to-day basis there are a variety of tools, just like you mentioned, on demand tools that are available. And I'm really impressed by the work that you do at Lingoda, and I know that you're working really hard in this industry, and I'm sure we would really benefit from learning where the future is going, like in the next few years. What would you say language learning will look like?
That's a great question, and you're right. The question is how do we use technology in the right way to enable people to learn better and to make the experience even more engaging.
Right.
There's a few things that are on my mind, and I'll share with you. The first thing is virtual reality in the goggles, is having these full immersion experiences. So imagine, Bakhtiyor, that you are learning French and you have the goggles on and you're at home and you can see the Eiffel Tower in the background and you're in a cafe and the waiter is your teacher and the lesson for the day is how to order a coffee, right? That is an experience that breaks the mold of what we can do today, right? Completely changes the way that you in effective learning, in that experience learning, and also just serves to make it so much more engaging, right? For now, we don't have that, but we will get there. We will get there one day. In the meantime, what, for example, Lingoda does is, in talking about building bridges, is we have people from all over the world in one class, right? So your teacher could be from France, you could be from America, and then the other students could be from Germany, China, Africa, and South America, right? All in one class. So in the meantime, that's what we have, but that is, I think, where we're going. The other thing I would say is asynchronous, which is one-way apps, has been very popular, and it's helped us to use technology to make language learning much more broadly available. But I think that as we talk about the skepticism, I think that there will be that shift to synchronous, because that synchronous at the end of the day is what people are there to do, which is actually to communicate, right? Correct. And to learn how to communicate in that language. And so I think that more and more that synchronous will be the center of that technology experience with virtual reality. And then asynchronous will be using a lot more adaptive learning, right? Will be used to capture how people learn so that the synchronous experience can be customized and more effective.
Right. And when you're looking at asynchronous, can you just give maybe another example of like how that would work, for example,
Sure.
for young people?
Sure. So let me give you an example for how that might work if we had, for example, let's say we had the cafe experience, right? Like the cafe experience in with the Eiffel Tower in the background. So let's say it's about coffee. It's about learning how to order coffee and how to order different things for breakfast. And it's about learning the past tense, how to conjugate the past tense in French. Okay. So what you would do is, like in the asynchronous, is prior to the class, you would get in your Lingoda app the vocabulary, right? How to say coffee, how to say fork, how to say whatever else, right? You would start to get an introduction, right, to how to conjugate past tense. Maybe you even have a couple of exercises, right? And then that would cap for the teacher once you go into the classroom, what you've actually learned today. So we don't have to go back and repeat, this is coffee. Coffee is masculine in French, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you can go straight to the actual conversation, right? The interaction, use the teacher for what they're best for.
Right.
And then thereafter, let's say that it's found that you don't conjugate past tense very well, but you learned all the words really well, or
Mm-hmm.
most of the words. Then you go back to the app, and the adaptive learning would then say, okay, let's focus more on conjugation of the past tense,
Mm-hmm.
and then the particular words that you didn't learn as well. And then that would build over time. So the idea is like you're using technology for what it's best for, and you're
Mm-hmm.
using the teacher for what she is best for.
Beautiful example. Thank you for sharing that. I'm kind of, as you're speaking about language learning, I'm remembering myself, 20 years ago when I was starting to learn English, and something that worked for me was, I used to sell ice cream. And so, behind our yard, I had this, ice cream fridge, and then I, was in high school. So, the way back in the day, the books would work, they would have vocabulary, at the end, right? So I would open the vocabulary and I will start, sort of translating it one by one and then applying it to the actual test to make sense of what the text was about. And over the course of my, sort of as I continued to succeed into college, that's the advice that I would give, to my relatives and to other people. Obviously, language learning today has completely changed. And then you brought, amazing examples of that. If you were to address, young generation today, what advice would you give them? Can you maybe share 2 or 3 tips for language learning, considering today's realities?
That's a really, really great question. I can think of a few different tips, as I've studied I studied languages. Sometimes I've done it well, sometimes I've done it poorly. I think the first thing is to practice speaking with native level speakers as much as possible. Okay, native level, because they speak like people would speak on the street, right? And it's the way it really sounds. And then just practice, right? That's number one. I think number two, it's interesting. I actually do that myself. So I break my own tip. But I actually would say, what you were just saying about looking at the back at the index and learning words, I actually say it's best to not translate to your native language if possible. In fact, Lingoda, even from the very first class, we do it in the native language, the language itself, not in your language, because you want to think in that language. And when you translate, it takes you 2 or 3 times as long to actually process, which is why people always say, I don't understand. Why is it that like when I listen to a language, I understand the first sentence, but I don't understand what happens after that? It's because if you translate back to your native language and then you have to produce back out what it is in the foreign language, right? It's hard for you to actually have that dialogue. And that's actually really my breakthrough when I was learning Spanish. The third thing I would say is, and I don't know how much you experienced this when you were learning English, was find a way to learn the real language that people speak on, right? So for example, in English, we actually don't say a lot, how are you? Right? We will say, what's up, what's going on, what's happening. Depending on the country, it'll be a little bit different. It'll cheers, right, is what the Brits say. So the reality, and that's a simple example, but take that to almost any phrase that you and I you're having right now, right? Any phrase. And so what often is in the textbook is not what we say. And so how do you actually get at that? Because that is where you will become more effective in understanding and also become more a part of the culture, because you're adopting those words. And then the last thing I would say is develop a regular habit of speaking. So just like with anything else that you do, playing tennis, learning piano, is if you can do it the same time every day over time, you will get what I call a radical incrementalism. Because what you do is it takes 21 days to build a habit. And once you actually build that habit, it almost becomes automated. You get better at the language, but it's not so hard. And so that's actually what we do with Lingoda, is we actually have something called the sprint, which allows you to build that habit. Once you build the habit, it's automated.
It's amazing. That's
Yep.
amazing. Michael, your work is really inspiring, and I'm kind of reflecting on my own fatherly, so to speak, take on language learning. I'm also raising bilingual kids, and some of what you're saying is very, very true. Our podcast listeners, I'm sure, there's a variety of needs for, the listeners and our audience. But, as we kind of learn to help young people succeed in their life, there are a number of things we need to do, and then again, one of them is to help them improve what they're really good at, right? And sometimes that comes at the expense of knowing what their strengths are and really helping them increase their potential. And most of the time when I'm looking at educating young people, it's not only them studying in let's say if it's an American studying in America, but also taking that opportunity, just like you mentioned earlier, to study abroad, to learn a new language. Can you address the audience who are perhaps, parents who really want their kids to succeed? Can you share some piece of wisdom, maybe a quote or something that you think would be useful for a parent to in relation to educating their kids on the importance of language learning? I know that sometimes as parents we could just cross the border and then our kid would be like,
Yeah.
"Can you stop that? Can you let me do my own thing?" But how do we hit that balance? Share some wisdom around that.
Would it be okay, Bakhtiyor, if I shared a story?
Absolutely. Love
Okay,
stories.
terrific. So 20 years ago, when I just graduated from school, I lived in Mexico City. And that's actually where I really learned my Spanish. And I was studying at a university, and I was also working for a nonprofit. And I had developed a whole group of Mexican friends. And they one time invited me out for a weekend to a small town, like a few hours from Mexico City. So Friday night, we drive out, streets of Mexico City, really, really busy. They start to dim, and then we end up in the countryside. And in the middle of nowhere, the car breaks down. And there's like 6 of us in the car. It's like a small car.
Wow.
Like, so this is like, right. So I'm literally like, all right. And we try to fix it and we can't fix it. There's no lights. And we managed to go to find a store,
Mhm.
phone. I'm dating myself a little here, but find a phone. And then, we call the tow truck, and the tow truck says, we'll be there somewhere between 4 to 7 hours. And I was
Wow.
like, what? Right. So basically, I was like so annoyed that the entire weekend was ruined. I was like sulking in the car. And my Mexican, they go and they find beer, and they buy beer, buy lots of alcohol. They turn up the radio, and they have a party right there at 12 at night in the middle of nowhere,
Wow.
and really like live in that moment, right? Which something that me as an American, I was sulking, and it took me a little bit, but I started to come out of my shell. And I ended up having a really, really great time, despite the fact that I ended up like sleeping on the ground, and the tow truck did not come until 8 in the morning. And my mouth was dirty, and I just felt the whole, but I really like actually treasured that, and that what they actually taught me. So
Mm.
living in that moment, and in that culture, it's very much more living in that moment for a variety of reasons. But so to get back to, the parents and to the educators, right, is that I invite every high school student to learn a language, study abroad, and have that version of my Mexican experience.
Wow. Well, you well said that. I mean, experiential learning is such a powerful tool, and I'm sure many educators, would be delighted to hear that. Michael, as we wrap up this episode, did you want to leave us with some good contacts or any resources, perhaps, Lingoda's websites, or, anything along the lines that you think will be useful for our podcast listeners?
Yes, absolutely. So you can reach me best on LinkedIn at Michael Shangkuan, and has actually a great offer, which is you can take 3 free trial classes, which is worth approximately $60. And so you can take 3 free classes, and no obligation, you can cancel to see what you think of the classes. So it's a great opportunity for you to give it a try. And you just go to Lingoda, Lingoda.com, and you will see that you can sign up for those free classes.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that, Michael. This has been really insightful conversation. I personally enjoyed learning a lot about language learning and the importance of it to improving our potential as young people, so to speak. So thank you for sharing yourself. Thank you for sharing your experience with us. And for our podcast listeners who are interested in learning more about Lingoda, feel free to check out the resources that Michael shared. And for those who are interested in learning more about the work that Forstay does, check us out at podcast.forstay.com or forstay.com, and we'll be right there with you. Michael, without further ado, thank you so much. We were honored to have you on this episode today.
Bakhtiyor, thanks so much for your time and for your invitation. I had a great time.
Likewise.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Education and Empowerment Podcast. This show is brought to you by Forstay, a SaaS-enabled online booking marketplace for student and intern housing. Forstay provides turnkey, all-in-one cloud-based accommodation software solutions for colleges, universities, and organizations. Learn more at offcampus.forstay.com and landlords.forstay.com.